Hi all, I'm Ollie, and I, for my sins, run a WISP that's been going for about 25 years. For those of you that don't know what a WISP is, we're a wireless ISP, so we use radio technology to get broadband to people traditionally in very, very hard to reach areas. The highlight of running a radio network in the middle of nowhere is that generally something is always trying to kill it. If you've been working in a data center for a while, you probably won't be aware of just what goes on with the weather when you're out in the middle of nowhere. So we have a usual selection of kind of wrath from on high failure modes. The first, probably the most prominent for us, is wind. And under 60 miles an hour normally doesn't give us too many problems. Sometimes we get some customer aerials damaged. Sometimes we have to go and realign some antennas. And occasionally some stuff gets fatigue and kind of falls apart. When the wind gets over 60 miles an hour, things get a little bit more interesting. Generally, we see handfuls of outages at a time with customers whose aerials have snapped off their roofs. We have some freestanding kind of non-penetrating masts that we use on churches and things like that. They generally tend to tip over when the wind gets very exciting. And we often have to go and realign aerials, so we spend a fair few days running around after every storm. Some of the blown over and the fatigue wear kind of looks a bit like that. And yes, those ones as well. That was all 1 year's worth of repairs. Other things that cause us problems. Lightning is a good one. Back in sort of 2014. Shortly after I took over running it, we had a storm not dissimilar to the one we had a couple of weeks ago. 30,000 lightning strikes in 2 hours, and that caused us a little bit of a headache. We had 3 mast sites affected on the most recent one, mostly UPS faults, and we lost 10 or 15 CPE radios, 20 routers, and a handful of power supplies. Most of the time, the stuff that kills us isn't so much being hit by lightning. We rarely see any of our gear get struck directly, but often it's the power and things getting fried by the main surges. So again, that normally keeps us busy, and 2 weeks ago was no exception. The other problem we do have is obviously keeping a network running in the middle of nowhere without power is hard work, and that happens in all storm conditions, and we generally have to run around with generators and batteries and solar panels and just about everything we can find to help keep people online. Now, another one that causes some grief, snow. Yep, we love a bit of snow. It does cause some radio signal degradation, so people's broadband generally gets worse the more it snows, and particularly when it starts to stick to the antennas, and then all of a sudden 20, 30, 50, 70 people's broadband just disappears. Very helpful. The only way to get it off again is with a broom. Well, the only way we've found so far. The upside of having to go up your masts in the middle of the snow is you do get some fairly spectacular views, though. That was a highlight from that particular year. And then rain really doesn't really cause us too much of a problem. Sometimes we get some signal degradation. I mean, you do technically get rain fade on wireless links, but we do all try and plan with plenty of margin, and the rain we get in this country, certainly in our part of the country, isn't enough to cause us much drama normally. Every now and then some gets into some cables and capillaries down to the power supplies and breaks them, and sometimes we get rain into damaged radios. It sort of creeps in through the plastic and fries them. But normally rain is not too much of a bother. That was until the 20th of October 2023. Just a bit of a disclaimer, the following slides will show some very harrowing stuff, mainly some water torture equipment, some less than stellar cable management that some of us aren't proud of. But that particular day, I had set out early that morning to go and visit one of my customers, and it had been raining a reasonable amount. Went to see them very early, about 8 o'clock. 9 o'clock, tried to get back to the office, and the roads aren't passable. And we're thinking, this is going to be a challenge. So I spent a bit of time driving around, and every road I tried to get up or down was also impassable. It became apparent fairly early on that was not going to be an ordinary day. So to give a little bit of background, We're based in a service office, and it's one of our primary POPs for our network. Crucially, all of our compute infrastructure is there. The building itself is on historic floodplain, but it was built strategically to deal with that. There are flood management facilities built into it. Up to this date, for 20 odd years, the water has sort of occasionally bothered those features, but never really caused them a problem. The building itself, the floor level, was built a metre above the highest ever recorded flood, and there's obviously plenty of sacrificial land and car parks and flood management features to deal with the occasions when it does get a little bit high. Just to show you, there's some of the retaining walls, flood management ponds, etc. So never really have we had anything to worry about, not until that day. By 10 o'clock, water had sort of made its way to all the sacrificial bits of the car park. I obviously had these photos sent to me because I couldn't get back there. And people were a little bit worried, but they thought, no, that's fine, that's within normal. Unfortunately, the owner of that Ford realised that that car was numbered from fairly early on, but the rest of the building, everybody thought was fine. By about 11 or 12 o'clock, it became apparent that things really weren't fine. That's the centre of our town, and the whole thing is underwater. Our office, well, that was getting pretty deep too. Yes. By late afternoon, the building itself was completely underwater, water levels at about 3 to 4 foot inside. The centre staff had managed to get people and objects upstairs as best they could. 18 people were trapped, no heat, no power, no way of getting home. And they'd at that point decided that they were going to cut the building power for safety. And what about our network? Well, I was quite lucky, it turns out. Not being able to get back meant I could get to one of our customers up on high ground on an old airfield. I managed to camp at their building, get logged into our network from there, and thankfully they had a 4G mast next door, which meant connectivity wasn't an issue at all. And at this point, we started properly disaster recovery planning in rather a hurry. It looked like they were going to cut the building power, so we started looking what we needed to do to migrate our compute infrastructure, get it all shut down. We know we had 40 minutes on the EPSs. We weren't aware at what point the water was going to breach the server room properly, so we just had to make an assumption that we could keep going while the power was still on. So we take a look, and what have we got on our compute infrastructure? CRM, DNS, monitoring, email, VPN, file stores, all the usual stuff for an ISP. We had a quick think about what we could afford to lose, and we decided, right, the DNS we cannot afford to lose. So very quickly, we swapped our resolvers over to public ones in the DHCP configs at all our sites. And somebody in the Scottish WISP chat suggested, thanks Bill, why don't you static NAT your DHCP servers to public ones on your network edge? And we thought, well, that's not a bad idea. So we do CG NAT for the wireless network, and we pump some static NAT in and shut the servers down. Some of our fibre customers were pointed at those resolvers, despite them being outside the fixed wireless core. Most of those got DHCP updates. And we had a few we were doing EOFTTP and similar, where we couldn't necessarily do that. For those that we had TR069, we pushed TR069 updates to force resolvers wherever we could. With that in mind, we just conduct an orchestrated shutdown of our network core, and we decided we'd take all the compute infrastructure offline. We had the DNS solved. We figured we could just about live without anything else, although running a network without monitoring is not recommended for any long periods of time. So when we started the shutdown, the wireless network stayed running. We obviously lost a POP, we lost a fibre site, we lost all our servers, but the network itself still stood. There were 7 customers directly connected to that POP. We lost those. Everybody else failed over to other parts of the network. There was a bit of a performance hit for some people. There was a bit of congestion at points, and we didn't have an easy way of managing that because we couldn't see it anymore, but we mostly let people get on with it, and most people managed fairly well. By the next morning, we'd realised there were some people that hadn't got the TR069 updates in time, so we'd started sending people out to have a look, try and get those manually fixed wherever we could. Still that evening, the floodwaters were still impassable. Everybody was still trapped in the building, and they were trapped overnight. So those of us that were not in the building decided to go and help in the communities as best we could. I went and rescued a few people and dropped them off at home because nobody could get their vehicles out of the town, and anybody that could, well, most of those vehicles had been underwater anyway, so they weren't going anywhere. The people in the building got a welfare check. They boated in a rescue team to come and check everybody was all right, and they all slept in the dark, in the cold, without any lights, in a corner of an office. Hats off to them. Next morning, we get in early. The floodwaters thankfully receded overnight, and by 8 or 9 o'clock, they'd gone. We could get back to the building. So we started going to have a recce to see what we could touch. The people in the building had managed to get out by about 10 a.m., and we were straight in there trying to salvage whatever we could, try and work out what the damage was. Slightly stymied by the loss adjuster, who said, "You can't touch anything for a few minutes while I take some photos," but that was fine. You'll have to excuse the quality of these photos. It was obviously dark, we had no power in the building, and we were running around quite a lot, so we forgot to take photos. But for the most part, we got a few just to document just how much fun this was. As you can see, that's the comms room, and it was pretty grim in there. So we start damage assessment. We'd lost most of the stock in our office. Thankfully, the high-value stuff was on high shelves. Sensitive electronics, radio spares, we had most of those, which was very nice. All our office furniture gone, all our corporate records gone, all our paper history gone. And the comms room itself, we were very lucky. Only 2 of our servers had gone underwater, along with 2 fairly large UPSs, which nobody wanted to go anywhere near at that point for obvious reasons. The waters had stopped millimetres away from our core equipment, thankfully. The rack adjacent to ours had the building's equipment in, and nearly all the structured cabling was above the water line. There was some WAN switches, some telephone switches had drowned, and their UPS had drowned as well, but most of the core stuff was still there. It got a bit grim. So those are the 2 servers we lost. You can see they were of a certain vintage. Thankfully, they had platform that we were migrating away from. All that was left on those was an old monitoring system and, kind of unhelpfully, our CRM system. So we had to give a bit of thought about what to do with that. And our office, that was also fairly grim. So what do we do to restore? Well, first thing we did in the morning was try and clear up as much as we could. We began swabbing, swabbed the comms rooms, swabbed the switchgear rooms, roped in anybody we could find locally to help. Our families were very helpful, as were partners, friends and family friends, and a few other tenants all turned up that morning to help get the building back vaguely into some form of shape. We spent all morning swabbing, cleaning, trying to just remove all the floodwaters and the mud and all the horrible stuff that goes with it. And by early afternoon, most of the swabbing and cleaning had been done to as best as we could do. Now, massive thank you to my brother, who decided he was going to take on the task of cleaning and swabbing the switchgear room in preparation for being the enlightened soul that was going to risk tripping the main breaker for us. We got a small UPS, we found a small inverter generator, we got our networking gear ready to go, and got all that lot back up and running. And then there's obviously a contamination risk, so we took as much care as possible to avoid getting too dirty or muddy. The very large UPSs were wheeled out exceptionally gingerly, and we replaced all the power cables to all of our gear. Just for record, that's the switchgear room. It's not big by data center standards, but it was big enough, and that's a large enough switch there, and nobody particularly wanted to go near that. My brother finally gets all that clear in the sort of late afternoon. It's dry, everything you can find is dry. He then goes and finds himself a giant piece of insulation, a very large glove, and a broom handle. Leans in to try and get the breaker handle with the broom handle, only to find it requires too much effort. At which point he decides the glove is the next best option, turns his back on it, hits the breaker, having isolated all the other building circuits, and thankfully that one stayed set, and thankfully nothing went pop. We've removed all the superfluous loads. We start to look at bringing things online. So we get the small UPS online, we get a dehumidifier online. We can't touch any of the building air conditioning because all the inverters have been underwater, so none of that is safe. But we get some form of dehumidification and some form of power to the comms room. Early evening, we start the process of re-engaging our network core. This is where things went a little bit wrong. We powered up the rack as it had been powered down. So we re-engaged core router, aggregation, and the network circuits. None of the server infrastructure, so no emails or monitoring. And as soon as the core came back online, the phone started ringing quite fast. We don't have any broadband. You should have. Our core's back. A good hour of entertainment was had trying to work out exactly what was going on at this point. Obviously, without monitoring, you can't really tell. A bit of digging later, and it turns out, of course, the aggregation switch had booted from its backup image and didn't have a current copy of the config. So all the VLANs were just being dumped into the same place, and the whole lot fell apart. First proper lesson we learnt then was that when you're doing a cold start one device at a time, console into it, and check what it's done before you touch anything else. Once we got that back up and running, we managed to track down some additional power supplies for the radios and all that kind of stuff, and we brought the radios back online, restoring the customers that we'd lost directly connected to the building. At that point, we then bring the rest of the servers back on and start the process of removing the mitigations we put in place. So the DNS and everything we brought back. All the servers came up without issue, apart from obviously the wet ones, which we hadn't touched at that point. So 11 p.m., no more than 24 hours after the flood started, we had everything re-engaged. We had our core back up and running. We had customers back online, and we were very much in need of some sleep at this point. The big problem then came, the two servers that were obviously on the old platform, we had backups of the data for those, but we didn't have any disk images. And we tried to restore the backups of that data and didn't have any vintage enough VMs to bring it back up on. So the restoration was a bit of a challenge. And at that point, we decided we had to somehow try and save those two servers. So what do you do with a server that's full of mud and floodwater? Well, you wash it, obviously. Without any other option, we decided to pull the drives out, get outside, get the hose out, and wash them thoroughly. Good 10, 15 minutes of hosing down per server. Obviously, the water hadn't been sitting in them too long. This was still within 24 hours. Nothing had particularly gone rusty or sort of crusty or horrible. So we just washed and washed and washed. We removed the batteries from the RAID controller as well, obviously. And then we stuck them up and left them to dry for a couple of days. Over the next 2 weeks, we then spent time working with the building management to help bring the rest of the building's infrastructure back on, because we provide all their connectivity in the building. We also help them with everything else. We've been in there a long time. They know us very well. And we put in some flood mitigation to help in future and to enable some more of the clear-up. We managed to get the upstairs of the building reopened to tenants 2 weeks after the floods. We replaced all the power in the comms room. We remounted PDUs at the top of racks. We clearly coloured new A and B feeds. And shortly after reopening, because if you saw from the earlier photos, some of the cabling came down to floor level and back up. Don't know whose design choice that was when the building was built, but it was a bit of an odd one. They contracted us to reroute all the structured cabling. So we took it from, because they had to get under it to clean the mud out. So we, at that point, we spent a whole weekend, just about every hour God sent, we rerouted all of the cabling back into the top of the rack rather than in from underneath, which meant that if it ever happens again, the server room can just be washed out, wiped out, carry on. So that was us rethreading it all and re-terminating the whole lot. We obviously generated a little bit of waste from this as well. There is a fair bit of cabling went to the scrapyard, a fair amount of batteries went to the scrapyard. We're now on first name terms with a couple of them. So, what did we learn? It's always the skeletons that bite you. This was the drowned servers, the missing configs, all that stuff that you don't really think about. they're also the happiest things when you fix them. As that photo clearly shows, that was the point I realised the 2 servers that we'd washed could be saved. That was when they'd first booted up and we managed to disk image them. Washing your servers does work too. If you get to them quickly enough, you wouldn't want to leave them too long. I don't think they'd survive very long at all. But if you can get the mud out fast, you're fine. If you haven't got a full DR plan, maybe spend some time thinking about how you pull the plug in a hurry, just as much as how you restore things in a hurry. Because having a controlled shutdown meant the gear was off when it got wet, and therefore the stuff that had gone underwater wasn't all fried. Backups are great, but we didn't have anywhere to restore them to at that point, so that's always worth thinking about. And your friends and family are probably amazing in a crisis. Always keep spare cabling and keep it somewhere out of reach. And controversially, perhaps ignore your insurance company. If we'd have waited, some of the tenants in our building were 3 or 4 weeks before the loss adjuster arrived, and they weren't allowed to touch anything in their offices until then. We were very lucky that, due to the circumstances we were in, we could just crack on. And I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't. We probably wouldn't be trading now. Think about your cold start sequences. Obviously, when stuff comes back on, what order do you do it in? We hadn't considered it until that point. We'd never really seen it as a problem when we'd had plenty of power cuts before and never had an issue with stuff coming up. So that's always worth a thought. And if water is going to be an issue, kill the power as fast as you can, because most stuff won't die if it's not energized at the time. One of the last things we did was we had an outside-in socket wired into that comms room now. So if this ever happens again, we can put our own power supply temporarily outside with a socket inside the comms room. We don't have to touch the building at all. We can run just that room off its own generator. Where are we now, 20 months later? We're working out of a temporary office still, but the rebuild of the downstairs was completed in March. The building is fully open, and we're taking a new top floor office at some point in the next month or 2. We had a few more gems with the comms room during the rebuild. All of you that operate a change freeze will know that nothing happens on a change freeze unless somebody's jumping up and down and yelling at you. So the first day of the Christmas change freeze, 2024, the people doing the rebuild said, those racks in the comms room, is there any chance you could take them out for a couple of weeks? No. Why? Oh, we need to put the flooring down. Okay. Have you got any ideas for how we could do this? I said, well, can you do the flooring in 2 halves, maybe? And they went off and had a think and went, yeah, I think we can make that work. So we, first night of the Christmas change freeze, we trundle into the building at 11 o'clock at night. We make some giant skateboards for the racks because none of them have any wheels. Jack them up, put them on the skateboards, shut them all down, and very gingerly move them to the back of the room. That was an adventure. 3 weeks after Christmas, they then asked us to move them all back, so we slide them all to the front. We decided bravely to do that live, and thankfully it worked. And then finally, they let us put them back down again some point in early February. Thanks, guys. For those of you in the AltNet Slack, you might be wondering there's a bit of this story missing. There isn't. The generator. Who remembers the videos of the generator? 1 or 2 of you? Yes. So, for those that didn't see it, when they cut the building power, the generator auto-started and proceeded to operate while surrounded by floodwaters. To the point it kept going and going remarkably well, up until the point the water entered the air inlet and it went bang. Made a bit of a mess. We very recently, maybe 2 months ago, we finally received our new generator, and the engineering company that fitted it have done an excellent job of giving it a new, very fetching set of feet. It now has its own stand, and it now sits above floodline. And they had great fun wiring it in. One last point on the wiring in. You may remember my brother did a fantastic job of re-energizing the comms room. Well, when they fitted the generator, we were there to supervise, and they took all of the switchgear apart. And it became apparent that we had all been very, very fortunate, because the tide line on the main 400 amp breaker had made it to about a millimetre below where the contact's entered. You can just about see in that photo the marks. Would that have caused us a problem re-energising? Probably not, but would it have blown all the fuses on the pole outside when that hit? Almost certainly. We were very, very lucky. So with that done, I'd like to give a little bit of special thanks. Our friends and families and the wonderful staff at the Business Centre for getting stuck into the repairs. Of special note, and I didn't find this out until much, much later after the event, was Emma and Louise from East Anglian Schools Trust, who were one of the other tenants at the time, had apparently been, as the water was filling the building up, been trying to sweep the water away from the comms room with brooms to try and keep the building up and running. We had no idea. That was an amazingly valiant effort. Unfortunately, futile in the end. We thank them very much for trying. And the AltNet and Scottish WISPs, Slack communities and members of our trade body, UK WISPer, we had an amazing offers of help, equipment, emergency aid. Everybody wanted to get stuck in and help us. So to all of you that are here and all of you that chipped in, thank you very much.
And indeed, thank you very much, Ollie. Mostly we put this one in towards the end of the day because we thought it would be a nice, entertaining and engaging talk to round up with, but it actually contained some very valuable advice that I hope none of you ever need.
I'll second that.
Are there any questions? Anybody like to? Yes.
Yeah, Jeff Bennett, Nokia. I was wondering, when you had the 18 people stranded overnight in the building,
yep,
and you mentioned that you called the emergency services, who do you call? I mean, is it 999 or?
I wasn't there, so I don't know, but they'd somehow, because us and the neighbouring town were hit, they'd somehow managed to coordinate inland rescue, basically, so a boat had turned up and had visited to check they were all right. Who told them? How they got there? I have no idea. I just saw the photos of a boat in the car park at about 10 o'clock at night going, this is interesting.
Local councils have plans for everything.
I'm sure they do. And just a quick follow-up. Do you have plans to have emergency provisions and stuff like that just in case?
So that's really on the building, not us, and I think they've done a little bit more planning around that, but also, you hope to get everybody out.
Yeah.
Normally. It happened so fast that they couldn't get people's vehicles. The whole town was gridlocked before anybody realised. So hopefully, yes, they have. Certainly, there's a couple of chairs that people can sleep on if needs be. We know that. We've found those. I don't know about the provisions. There is a snack bar, so maybe that could get salvaged.
I'm thinking beer and bottles of whiskey, but,
I've always got a whiskey in the desk. I'll be all right.
Thank you.
Any more, or Matt, anything from remote? In which case, thank you very much indeed. I will make one point, though.
Yes.
Your nice generator has legs that take it above the highest flood line so far. Just saying.
Yes, that's what the insurance company asked for.
Thank you very much indeed,
Lovely.
sir.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you all.
Right.